Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the North Church. My name is Layne Nason, in case you don't know me already. So today I'm going to be talking about the final years of the Abbott School, which are from 1918 to 1933. So I wanted to give a brief explanation to folks who might not know what the Abbott School is. The Abbott School for Boys was a private boys' school that existed where Abbott Park is today, and part of the where the Roberts Learning Center is and the amphitheater. That was all part of the Abbott School grounds, and of course Hippick Field. It existed from 1844 to 1933, underwent many changes through its history, various different eras of different headmasters. And I'm going to be talking about the last era of the Abbott School before it finally closed. So I did want to warn all of you folks beforehand that there's going to be some pretty distressing things that happened at the Abbott School during the 1920s in regards to suicide and murder. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. So the where we left off, I did a presentation a couple of years ago on the headmastership of George Dudley Church, which was the most, probably the most. It was the best time in Abbott's history. But in December of 1917, a horrific dormitory fire really set that back. So here are some photographs of the fire. And you can see that it's just utterly decimated. Here's a picture inside the building and a picture of the front. But what I did want to mention is that there's an interesting story about the fire that I love to tell about Reverend Paul Gordon Favor, who's the man on the left, and the Abbott School coach, Ralph Roberts, on the right. Paul Gordon Favor was the minister at Old South Congregational Church at the time. His interesting fact about him is that his niece was actress Betty Davis. And so he and Coach Roberts arrived at the Abbott dormitory the night of the fire in 1917, and they climbed up to the roof, and they were having Abbott boys giving fire extinguishers, handing them up as they tried to put out the flames. And so once they were up there, the snow had been keeping the flames back quite a bit, but then once the snow had melted, it just took off. And eventually the smoke was just so bad that Favor and Coach Roberts had to evacuate. So they went down, they jumped down into the skylight into fire, basically, a fiery inferno. Coach Roberts singed his eyebrows, and Paul Gordon Favor's scared. He doesn't want to jump down the fiery hole, and Coach Roberts says, "You got to jump, or, quick or too late." And so Favor said he heard the voice of God, and he jumped down into the hole, into Coach Roberts' arms. And they got out of the building, but as you could see in the previous pictures, most of the front of the roof of the front of the building and the entire back section was destroyed. Now we go into 1918. So in 1918, Coach Ralph Roberts resigned from the Abbott School in April. He started at the school in 1913, and he went on to engage with the YMCA Red Triangle workforce in France. He was replaced by a gentleman named James De Weaver. He was only at Abbott in 1918, but he had a pretty interesting life that I want to mention a few things. After Abbott, he went to the high school in Dexter for several years, In 1925, he became a board member of the Philadelphia Athletic Conference. In 1931, he went to Coney High School. He was the superintendent of schools in Danforth and later New Sharon. He moved to Cape Cod Hill Road in New Sharon and sought the county Senate seat in 1958. He was very involved in Democratic politics. He was a very well-known Democrat in the area at that time. He was the town selectman and tax collector of New Sharon, and he died in Connecticut in 1978. So I wanted to talk about the last class to graduate under the headmastership of George Dudley Church. This is the class of 1918 on the right, and these three boys on the left are class of 1918. From left to right, that's John Deering, Salvador Laborde, and John Vose. So I'm going to give a little bit of information. So John Deering, he was from Portland, entered Boston University. He was the heir of Deering Lumber Company. He later killed himself in 1955 after a bitter divorce. William Eddy of Boston entered the Navy. His cousin Randolph and his older brother Robert also attended the Abbott School. Frederick Fisher of Norwood, Massachusetts entered agriculture. Thomas Hyland of Grafton, Massachusetts entered the New England Conservatory, and he also had a fondness for cross-dressing. Salvador Laborde of Havana, Cuba entered Cornell University, and I'm going to talk more about him later because he comes back up. Let's see. John Vose of East Eddington, Maine entered Bowdoin. Later, he became an alcoholic and a womanizer, and his son disowned him. Jose Arula of Bilbao, Spain entered the Louisiana University. So that's kind of a look at the graduates of Abbott in 1918. So, talking to Glenn, I'm not going to talk much about the gentleman on the right because that's for the Veterans Day presentation that will be held. But I want to talk a bit about the gentleman on the left. So this young man was John Fallon of Roslindale, Massachusetts, and was a student at the school around 1914 to 1915. He was on the great 1914 football team that won every single game, and in every case, the opponents didn't score a single point during the entire season. Completely, utterly undefeated. In the fall of 1915, he left the school with another boy with the intention of reaching Montreal to see the world. The boys were caught by the police, who held them until Headmaster Church arrived. Church had no choice but to expel the young men. Fallon later joined the armed services in Massachusetts and died in action in August of 1918. The man on the right is Ralph G. White. So, Headmaster Church left Abbott for Worcester Academy in Massachusetts. He left Abbott in August of 1918 due to the war conditions and his wife's health at the time of the armistice. Her family, the Bigelows, were in Worcester. He became the registrar of the school for many years. And interesting note, the school is still operating today. Church remained the owner of the Abbott School until 1921, when he relinquished ownership of the school to the next headmaster. So eventually, through 1919 and 1920, the Abbott School dormitory was repaired, although it wasn't repaired the same way. So this is a before photo of what the dormitory looked like. Here's an after. That was the plan for the dormitory on the left, which was never fully realized. So what they did was they just repaired what was burnt. And so that is how it looked afterwards. Now, interesting story. In July of 1920, Camp Kineawatha, led by Elizabeth Bass from Wilton, stayed in the newly repaired Abbott School dormitory in July of 1920. They played tennis at Hippick Field, had weekend trips to Wilson Lake, Mount Blue, and Rangeley, and were tutored in subjects that they struggled with during the daytime. Similar to what Headmaster Church did with the what was called the Abbott Hill Recreation School. It was the Abbott Summer School. So here we get to a new era at Abbott. Abbott reopened for the fall of 1920 under the headmastership of this gentleman on the left here, Moses Bradstreet Perkins. Now, he had a glowing resume. He taught on Long Island in New York, and for several years he taught at Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire. He had some great teachers on his staff at Abbott, one of them being Edward Connors. Edward Connors graduated from Gardner High School in 1913. He graduated from Bates College in 1917, which is interesting because he graduated in the same class as James DeWeaver, the gentleman that we saw earlier who was the athletic director. They were both played on the same football team. He served in the Navy during the Great War and also served on the American Commission in France for negotiating peace, ending the war. He joined the Abbott staff in January of 1921 to teach math and science. He stayed at Abbott until he married Thelma McCleary in 1923, taking a job at Wilfred McCleary Hardware Store. His daughter...
Right? I mean, wouldn't it? His relative is
his father-in-law.
Right.
Yeah. His daughter, Nancy Flick, is currently on the board of trustees of the Farmington Historical Society. So, very interesting story here. The Abbott boys were coming back with Headmaster Perkins from a trip to Rangeley in June of 1921. On the Strong Road, a tire was spotted in the middle of the road. Perkins, with his wife in the front car, swerved around it and ignored the tire, thinking it was just a joke. The next car of Abbott boys stopped to take it. Suddenly, 5 masked men charged at the boys with guns. The boys ran back and got into their vehicle, speeding away. So, next we come to Sal Laborde again, as I talked about him earlier, who was in the class of 1918. Sal Laborde, a student at Cornell at the time, was visiting his friends Jose Antuna and Manuel Fernandez in New Jersey in August of 1921. They were also Abbott boys at one point in time. While at a party, which was a masquerade ball, Laborde's friend Antuna thought he saw a woman with whom he was friends with. He approached her and spoke to her. The woman turned and apologized, saying she wasn't the friend. However, the woman's boyfriend, Cecil Arthur, decided to pick a fight. Laborde stepped in between the two to break it up, and Arthur threatened him that he was going to harm him later. Later in the party, in the grill room, Arthur attacked Laborde. At one point, Sal punched the other man in the chin, causing him to lose balance. The man cracked his skull on the concrete floor, dying. Laborde was charged with murder. Some people said that Laborde attacked Arthur in the grill room, but it was later determined to be false. Eventually, he was found not guilty due to self-defense, being acquitted in January of 1922. Also in January of 1922, an Abbott boy slipped coming down the back staircase of the dormitory. His ring got caught on something, nearly taking his whole finger off. At Franklin Memorial, it was amputated at the second joint.
You sure it's Franklin Memorial?
No, actually, yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
You're right.
Yeah, that it probably would have been in one of the local.
Dr. Bell's hospital, maybe.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Let's see. So, Perkins turned out to be a con man of sorts. It was discovered that the headmaster wasn't paying his bills. When the Board of Trustees found out about this in April of 1922, Wilfred McCleary went down to Worcester to discuss the matter with former headmaster Church. A few days later, both Perkins and his wife fled town, never to be seen again, and didn't give an address of where they went. Roy McCormick, a teacher at Abbott, became headmaster after this, though he wasn't much better, as Abbott had unpaid taxes in 1923. Perkins later found himself a job at the Clark School in Hanover, New Hampshire. Also interesting to note, Clinton Greenwood, son of Chester, taught for 7 months at the school before resigning in April of 1922.
Before he went into the insurance business at our office.
That's right. Mm-hmm. So, in May of 1922, Governor Percival Baxter visited Farmington. He made a stop at the Abbott School, speaking to the boys on the importance of leading a useful life. He also shared a motto that his father had given him when which had helped him through his life, and invited the boys to visit him in Augusta any time. The boys gave a hearty Abbott cheer and 3 cheers for Governor Baxter. So, while the Halloween party did not take place at Purington Hall, the boys were invited to a party at the dormitory earlier in the month, which is why I included this picture. The Halloween party was held in the Hippick Field House. The main room was decorated with witches, cats, streamers, and jack-o'-lanterns. A roaring fire was started in the fireplace. A dance was held, as well as a costume contest, pie-eating contest, and a contest to see what boy could put on all of the clothes in a suitcase and then take them all off again. Refreshments were served, and the boys and their guests toasted marshmallows. In July of 1923, the Farmington State Normal School rented out the Abbott dormitory for normal school students attending the summer session, with some more students going there for their meals. Many amusing contests were held on Hippick Field during the session. The Abbott School was reorganized as a corporation in November of 1923. The president of the corporation was Wilbert G. Mallett of the Farmington State Normal School, who was the principal at the time, and the treasurer was E.E. Flood, and I believe he was affiliated with Flood Shoe Store. And other members were Robert McCleary, Kenneth Ramsey, and Arthur French. Also in November of 1923, Helen Church, the wife of former headmaster Church, bought the Jacob Abbott house, few acres, and restored it. Orrin Haskell took the headmastership in January of 1924, and the school was sold to him in September. Haskell was a lieutenant in the Navy during the Great War, and he had graduated from Annapolis Naval Academy. At one point, he was in command of the USS Bainbridge. He owned the school for several more years with his brother Charles Haskell, Charles having come to Abbott in 1925 from being principal of South Portland High School, eventually handing over the school fully to Charles in the latter portion of the decade. Tragedy struck the Abbott School in March of 1925. Sisto Rubiales, a student from Havana, Cuba, was staying with the other international students at Abbott during Easter break. Just before the students were about to take their supper at the Exchange Hotel, a loud bang resonated through the dormitory. They went to the origin of the noise, discovering that their friend had shot himself, a bullet wound in his head. Dr. George Pratt was called to the dormitory, but the boy eventually succumbed to his wound later at the hospital. He had a traditional Catholic funeral at the Abbott School. His body was not returned to his family in Cuba, but was interred in Riverside Cemetery here in Farmington.
Is that the stone?
That's the stone, yes. So at an Abbott Hebron Academy baseball game at Hippick Field in May of 1925, it was discovered that the Hebron boys' pockets were devoid of what money they brought with them. It was discovered that a boy named Nicholas Blarney was the pickpocket. He was ordered by Judge Sumner Mills that he return the money, pay the costs, and spend 30 days in jail.
So how much did he steal?
I don't know. It didn't say how much he stole. but he had to pay back whatever he stole plus the costs and spend 30 days in jail. And he was, it said a boy, so he must have been under the age of 21 or 18. So who knows how old he was. So an interesting student to touch upon is William Ibargüen. Ibargüen was an Abbott boy from Spain originally, but his father ran plantations in Guatemala. He was on the football team for several years before his graduation in 1925. After graduating, William married Jarvis Tyler's daughter, Maxine, and moved back to Guatemala sometime after. And Paul, I was wondering if you could bring up the story of what happened to William Ibargüen later in life.
Well, as many people here may be well aware of this, I am, that unfortunately he was kidnapped, taken hostage, and his body was found at the bottom of a lake in about 1970, I think it was.
Yeah.
Other people here may have more ideas.
In Guatemala.
Yes, oh, yes, of course. I don't mean to put it that way. Right. And so, of course, his son lives in this neighborhood today.
Right, yes, he lives in the house on the corner there. So the Abbott School, quite familiar with fires, suffered two within several days of each other in January of 1926. The first fire, which occurred the morning of January 28th, was discovered when smoke was seen pouring from the basement of Edward Abbott Hall, which you see in that picture there. Headmaster Charles Haskell, along with Coach Comerford and the boys, subdued the flames until the fire department arrived. It was discovered that the fire started in a bin of coal and wood located in the boiler room. The fire caused around $200 in damages. 3 days later, on the evening of January 31st, flames were once again seen coming from Edward Abbott Hall. The fire department arrived again, putting out the flames, but partitions had to be destroyed to fight the blaze, which resulted in around $1,000 in damages. Sounds to me like somebody was trying to set the building on fire. So, in November of 1926, Louis Hippick, who put the money in for the creation of the Howard Hippick Memorial Athletic Field for the Abbott School in 1916, bought a small parcel of land adjoining the field from former Headmaster Church to expand the facility. Hippick had given the Abbott School $1,000 the previous summer to help maintain and repair the field. Now, this is a bit of a fun story, and this isn't a picture from the Abbott School, but it was the only one I could find of boys building an igloo. In March of 1927, the Abbott boys decided to build a very large igloo on the grounds of the school. Using all the equipment available to them and missing supper, the boys built a grand snow fortress with 3 large rooms big enough to stand in. So in June of 1927, Alfonso Ibargüen, William's younger brother, graduated from the Abbott School. After graduation, unlike his brother, Alfonso decided to stay in Farmington. He made his home in West Farmington. Alfonso was very active in the Rotary, often giving talks about Abbott or life in Guatemala to the organization. In 1937, Ibargüen built the largest telescope in the state of Maine in West Farmington. The telescope remained there for many years. Alfonso's children still live in the area today and are the only descendants of Abbott students, along with William's son, Bill Ibargüen, that have remained in the Farmington area. So another tragedy struck Abbott when in September of 1927, Arthur Perkins passed away. Perkins was a graduate of the Abbott School in 1878. He attended Bowdoin and graduated from there in 1887. In 1890, he received his master's degree. He later studied law at Harvard and was admitted to the bar but never practiced. He was in the real estate business for many years, making his home in a house where the water department is today. Later in life, during the early 1920s, he became a teacher at the Abbott School. At his funeral, every Abbott boy paid their respects to their teacher.
He was a companion of, for a while, of Evelyn Butler, who later became Evelyn Butler Ennis. He was a tutor to students. My Uncle William, who was incapacitated with a heart ailment for a year, who had to stay out of high school in the 1920s. And Mr. Perkins was one of the persons that came to his home and tutored him. And Perkins would recall some events of his life, and he said that he was attending, the year he graduated from Bowdoin at the time of the commencement was the occasion in when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow spoke to the commencement. I believe it was his 50th reunion from Bowdoin, at which time Longfellow delivered the poem. I'm not sure if this was the first time he delivered it or wrote it for the occasion. Mortuari salutamus. I don't know how to pronounce it in Latin. Somebody else knows it better than I do. But anyway, we who are about to die salute you. And so he was witness to that somewhat historic cultural occasion, Arthur Perkins himself.
That's incredible. So going back to the Church family, in June of 1928, George Dudley and Helen Church's daughter, Elizabeth, married lawyer Harold Mitchell. They made their home in Hartford, Connecticut. The Mitchells never had any children, and Harold died of a massive heart attack in 1950. He was very big in the Connecticut GOP. In fact, he was on a campaign trail or something like that in 1950 when he had his massive heart attack. I think he was in Nebraska. Elizabeth later remarried Dr. George Martin in 1976, and they were together until Helen's death in 1994. One of the biggest transformations to the Abbott School occurred in October of 1928 when the Abbott School for Boys was changed to the Abbott Junior College, the first junior college in New England. This reorganization was an attempt to try something different at the school. The board had a couple of alumni on it, such as George Briggs of the class of 1915 and Thomas Goodall of the class of 1912. What's interesting about that is if Thomas Goodall was part of the Goodall-Worsted Manufacturing Company in Sanford, which was a very major manufacturing company in the state of Maine. In fact, Thomas Goodall, the original Thomas Goodall, so this gentleman's grandfather, was once the richest man in Maine. The board also included Payson Smith, who was a former superintendent of schools. The experiment, however, was a complete failure, as we will see.
Payson Smith was the former state, you might realize that. He was the superintendent of schools for the whole state of Maine.
Yep.
And he taught in Portland, and there was a building at the Portland campus of the University of Maine that was named for him a number of years, Payson Smith Hall, I believe.
Yep. Let's see. So another horrifically tragic note in Abbott school history was the death of former teacher Albert Swenson in December of 1928. Swenson was a teacher at Abbott from 1916 to 1917. In November of 1917, Swenson attempted to take his own life by shooting himself in the chest. Several Abbott students found him, and Headmaster Church rushed him to Lewiston, where he recovered. After leaving Abbott, he married Catherine Payne, daughter of local merchant Fred G. Payne. Swenson became the associate headmaster of the Huntington School for Boys in Boston in 1926, having been a faculty member since 1919. In the months leading up to December of 1928, he had become despondent due to an illness not being alleviated. On December 21st, he was visiting his brother's office in Providence, Rhode Island. At around 6:30, he left the office, climbed to the roof, and jumped off the building, killing himself. On New Year's Eve of 1928, a fire broke out in the former home of Alexander Hamilton Abbott on Lake Avenue. Abbott, the principal of the Abbott School from 1849 to 1899, was the man who oversaw much beautification of the grounds. He had the bridges built, the ponds dug, and the landscape beautified. The fire originated in the chimney of the Harry Bryant apartment in the building. After the fire, the house was rebuilt and still stands today. The only thing that survived that fire was the barn, as you can see in the comparison between the two pictures. In March of 1930, the Abbott School was sued by Herbert Parker for $1,000. This isn't Herbert Parker, by the way, that's Frank W. Butler, who may have represented Abbott in this case, but I'm not 100% certain. It didn't list who the attorneys were. Parker stated that Charles Haskell, the headmaster of the Abbott School, told him that Abbott had an enrollment of 40 to 50 boys, had football, basketball, and baseball teams, and had a trained nurse. He enrolled his son in the institution where it was learned that those statements were no longer true. The judgment for this case was not reported on that I could find. After being sued and getting hit with the Great Depression, Abbott was practically extinct by 1930. As stated earlier, the junior college experiment failed miserably. The school didn't open at all for the 1930 to 1931 school year. Edward Abbott Hall hadn't been used since June of 1929. The only uses of the Abbott property were by the DAR in February of 1930 to host a meeting, and the use of the grounds by the Farmington State Normal School in the summer of 1930. However, prospects looked better come 1931. At the start of that year, alumni had met with former headmaster and Mrs. Church in Boston. At these meetings, Church recommended returning to the old Abbott School for Boys model and getting at least 40 boys for a given school year. In the fall of 1931, Abbott opened one last time. The rate of tuition was reduced from $1,200 to only $390, the lowest it had been since the 19th century. New teachers were hired, including William Pond as a French teacher, the gentleman on the left. He was a former champion golfer in Vermont and a graduate of Princeton University. Pond later went to the Clark School and worked alongside Moses Bradstreet Perkins. And Edward Stokes as athletic director. He was a two-letter man at Dartmouth, earning his D's in both football and basketball. Sadly, the Abbott School continued having financial trouble in 1932. They were sued again in August of that year. After the school year ended, it was stated that if Abbott couldn't get at least 40 boys for the 1932 to 1933 school year, it would not reopen. When the time came, the institution was unable to get 40 boys. In August of 1933, former headmaster Church resigned from his post at Worcester Academy, leaving for the Westminster School in Simsbury, Connecticut, becoming the director of admissions. Interesting to note, that school is also still in operation to this day. He stayed there until the late 1930s when he and his wife retired to Mount Dora, Florida. Church died in 1953 and Mrs. Church died in 1972. And the Abbott School died in August of 1933. At that point, the property was foreclosed upon by the Livermore Falls Trust Company. Hippick Field went to the town in 1935. The remaining grounds remained vacant until 1937 when Errol Dearborn of the Farmington State Normal School bought the property. He gave half to Kappa Delta Phi. The Abbott dormitory became the Kappa Delta Phi fraternity house in 1937, and half to Frank Springer in 1940. The Kappa side was demolished in the 1960s by Real Estate Inc. for a strip mall that was never built. The Springer side was later sold to Walter Barker, with said Springer having torn down Edward Abbott Hall. In 1968, the university took the Real Estate Inc. land by eminent domain, constructing the Roberts Learning Center in 1970 where the Abbott dormitory was. The university got the piece from Barker around 1968 as well, and they tore down the gymnasium in 1970. Today, part of the Abbott School grounds are now known as Abbott Park. And that is the end. Are there any questions or comments or anything?
Layne, do you want to tell the future story of that?
Oh, sure, I can do that. Well, I am currently part of a group of people who are trying to restore the Abbott School grounds because it's been 40 years since the Abbott Park Restoration Project, and many of the bridges are looking in really terrible shape. So I'm working with Professor Luke Kellett at the university, Dr. Teresa Overall, retired professor from the university, and the Farmington Historical Society is also working on this to restore the bridges, perhaps rebuild one of the bridges, the Bridge of Three Brothers, to dredge Rollo Pond, and to really beautify Abbott Park in a way that is reminiscent as much as we can to what it was before the 60s when it was bulldozed.
Thank you, Layne. That's important to do.
Thank you. It's a 10-year plan, so there may, there's definitely.
We'll hear about it again then.
Yes, you will hear about it again.
Once a year. No.
But any questions or yes?
Two. So the current parking lot for the Learning Center,
Mm-hmm.
is that when Little Blue was reduced and the portion of Rollo Pond that was in that vicinity was eliminated, or was that done by the real estate developer before?
I believe that the parking lot was, I'm trying to remember. I imagine it was put in when Roberts Learning Center was built. But I do know that the real estate company is the one that just totally cleared everything. The original Rollo Pond was filled in with Little Blue Mountain.
Okay, in that, thank
It
you.
was
Yeah.
kind of a playground for those of us in the neighborhood. And all through the 60s, it was dormant for about 6 or 7 years. Nothing was happening. There was these great embankments. He made great snow embankments. You could go sliding on them, tobogganing, that type of thing. An incredible amount of excavation occurred about 1961 and 1962. In anticipation, it was Lucarelli, some people from Livermore Falls who...
Luciano, yeah.
And Luciano, right. It's right, Luciano, not Lucarelli, that's correct. Lucarelli was the bakery guy, I was wrong. Luciano, okay, God, you're right. So anyway, Luciano did that. They're both from Livermore Falls. But anyway, that's why it was a combination. So, yes, it looked like an earthquake had hit, looked like a bomb had hit the place. And so that these huge, steep sand pits and that had been excavated, and you could walk up and down. You could take it as a shortcut walking from, where the Ed Center is now, going down through to like Hickory Field. People walking across the thing, but nothing happened for years. But the speculation was that Luciano was going to build a grocery store, going to build a bowling alley, and this was at a point, of course, before, say, it was a sprawl that spread out to Route 2. So it was a very logical expansion of downtown Farmington in that for commercial development.
Right.
That occurred, however, just after Harding McMinimum had built what would be called the IGA Shopping Center. The IGA Shopping Center about a couple of years before Luciano came in and did this. And so I think that sort of stole their thunder to some extent. The IGA Shopping Center consisted of these buildings just before you get to the fire station, which had more recently was the university, and there was a drugstore, a laundromat, and the IGA supermarket. And because of that, I think that kind of preempted what was going to happen with Luciano.
Right.
So my second
Yeah.
question was, were there a lot of these little schools at that time? In other words, how did the people running the Abbott School recruit these boys from Cuba and from Connecticut, Massachusetts?
Well, a lot of these boys had guardians that lived in places like New York City or in Boston. Under the church administration anyways, church would go down to Boston every year to the Parker House and meet with prospective people. A lot of these folks, Abbott was very well advertised, and most people had family members these folks that were from Cuba and Guatemala and Spain had family members or friends who also went to the Abbott school, so they told them about it, and so it was really a lot of word of mouth, but also a lot of really good advertising through especially the church administration, 1902 to 1918. I believe that one of the reasons why Abbott failed in the 1920s is that the advertising wasn't as good. But of course, there were other factors, of course, like the Depression, and yeah.
And there were students from prominent families throughout the Northeast as well.
Right.
About the same era, certainly in the teens before World War I, the son of Chief Justice Rugg of the Massachusetts Supreme Court was a graduate, and Chief Justice Rugg spoke there. He's known in the law of torts and negligence for a somewhat notable pronouncement, and that the difference between negligence, recklessness, and intentional acts are the difference between those committed by a fool, a darn fool, and a gall darn fool. Except
Well,
he used more
yeah.
explicit language than what I thought.
Also, one of the mayors of Boston, Edwin Upton Curtis, also went to the Abbott School. He actually, in the early 1930s, had a letter written about him by President Hoover. And Curtis was also a graduate of the Abbott School.
Well, of course, Louis Hippick, a very prominent Chicago business person. This is before the time of your presentation tonight.
Right.
But it showed that people were coming both from domestic locations as well as, of course, overseas to the school.
Right. Yes.
What about the railroad car?
The railroad car, that ended sometime between when A.H. Abbott left the Abbotts, when he died, and when church began. So I think somewhere around the turn of the last century, the railroad cars stopped running. And what it is in the 1840s, the first railroad in Franklin County was created on the grounds of the Abbott School. And what it actually was a glorified roller coaster. And a very early primitive roller coaster where the carts were put at the top of the hill, and they would go down the hill and across what's known as Railroad Bridge, which is still in existence today. And there's a story about Father Isaac Rogers, who, as you might know, was the first minister of the Old South Congregational Church, the original Old South Congregational Church. He apparently got into one of the rail carts, and he was a bit of a portly gentleman, and he caused an imbalance, which caused it to derail, and he got injured.
Layne,
Yes.
About how many students were there, say in 1929, let's say the last year or so?
3 or 4.
Okay. And at their height, they had around 40 or 50?
40 to 50, yeah. There was a time with the original dormitory where enrollment, I believe in the 1870s, reached 70. But that was the highest it ever had been. And at least in the 20th century, the highest it had ever reached was 40. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes.
you said when you were in 1920, you said Lizzie Bass had worked with the Abbott School to educate girls.
Yes.
And it happened another time earlier? You
Let me see here. I'm just going to, let's see. It was in July of 1920. And it was similar to what George Dudley Church did with the Abbott boys for their summer school, which was called the Abbott Hill Recreation School.
So it only had to do with the summer.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting. Had girls gone to that school prior?
No. In fact, the Abbott School, under the title of the Abbott School, was always a boys' school.
Yet 2 of the Abbott sons started a girls' school in Massachusetts, a girls' school in New York City called Spangler Institute that was the precursor to women's colleges. It was so highly regarded.
Mm-hmm.
And evidently, Emmeline Perkins, Lafayette and Dorcas Perkins, Abbott Perkins' daughter, went to Spangler.
Hmm.
and then came back and was somehow involved in girls' schools here in Farmington.
Hmm.
Was that
Might have
the
been-
May school?
Pardon?
Was it the May school with the May sisters?
Claudia told me she thought there were either 2 or 3 girls' schools, so we
Okay.
haven't figured out which one yet.
Okay.
But interestingly enough, she has the smallest stone on this, on the plot, on that wonderful plot. And, she gets very little recognition.
Well, we'll have to change that.
Yes, we will. Are there any other questions, comments?
Did you follow up, I came in a little bit late, you mentioned James DeWeaver,
Yes.
and you probably made the fact that fast forward, he spent his career after the Abbott School here in Franklin County.
Yep.
Yes, okay, superintendent of schools and.
Yes, yep. Yeah, mentioned all of that, and,
Oh, James DeWeaver, he was the Democratic nominee for the Maine State Senate in 1958.
Yep.
He lost by only about 800 votes to Shelton Nason, and he was the Democratic nominee for the Maine House of Representatives from, this would be New Sharon, Chesterville, Jay, and Wilson, and he didn't quite make it that way, but he was a Democrat in a very Republican community, of course, superintendent of schools, and the union that included, but was not limited to, like, Rome and New Sharon, that type of thing.
right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming to my meeting.